Thanks very much, Jackie, and thanks to the organizers for having me here today. So I've been asked to talk about the context of the protein transition. And as you can see from the title of my presentation, I'll be looking at this within the broader context of a transition to sustainable food systems that's required. And I'll be looking at the current trends around protein and thinking about whether this is taking us in the direction of a transition to sustainable food systems more broadly. First of all, a quick word about PROTEIN2FOOD itself. As Jackie mentioned, it's the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. We have 27 expert panel members from 18 different countries around the world. The idea behind PROTEIN2FOOD was that food systems are fundamentally complex. And if we're going to understand them and analyze them and bring policy recommendations for reforming them, we need to bring together all of the different areas of expertise and types of knowledge around food systems in all of their complexity. So our panel includes agronomists, political scientists, environmental scientists, nutritionists, development economists, and experienced practitioners from civil society and from social movements. PROTEIN2FOOD has developed a number of policy reports on some of the most pressing issues in our food systems over the last few years. This conference comes at a good time because we're actually going to be publishing a report on meat and proteins later this year. It's really at the early stages, so I can't share any meaningful conclusions from it today, but this is a useful exercise for me to share some of our initial thoughts to help set the stage in this debate. One report that I will be drawing on today, and which you can find on our website, hopefully quite easily, a report from 2016 called From Uniformity to Diversity. So first of all, why are we talking about proteins and a protein transition? It's primarily because of the growing awareness that livestock systems on their current trajectories are fundamentally unsustainable. First of all, it's worth noting animal source foods supply 40% of the world's protein. It's very different percentages in different regions. Some more key context, the trend is upwards. There's been a doubling of per capita meat consumption between 1961 and 2018, and consumption is continuing to rise now in several regions of the world. And as I mentioned, there is now growing consensus that livestock is a major contributor to many of the most important environmental challenges and environmental problems in our food systems, from greenhouse gas emissions to biodiversity loss, groundwater contamination with nitrates, antibiotic resistance, and many other problems. And just to highlight a couple of data points of particular relevance for the EU, by 2030, livestock will be responsible for 72% of the EU's emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture. A lesser-known problem, perhaps, is the contribution of the livestock sector to the emerging crisis of antimicrobial resistance. It's a shocking fact that the livestock sector actually uses more antibiotics than human medicine in the EU, and antimicrobial resistance problems already accounting for 33,000 deaths per year in the EU. Another key point, these impacts are direct, they're also indirect as a result of the protein feed requirements of our livestock sector, which often have to be imported from other regions of the world at a great cost in terms of land and resources. And these protein feed imports actually increased by 150% between 1980 and 2010, even though a huge percentage of EU grain production goes to animal feed already. So as I said, this has a high footprint, and particularly when we're sourcing this feed from the Amazon region and other regions associated with deforestation. These are just environmental impacts. Obviously, there are a series of health impacts associated with overconsumption of meat, links to cancer, links to obesity. I'm not going in detail here just to keep to time. And there are obviously concerns around animal welfare too, already mentioned as another driver of the protein debate and the growing awareness of the need to shift our protein sources. However, It's also important to note that these problems are not limited to the livestock sector, and we're actually facing a broader environmental crisis and social crisis across our food systems. If we look at fisheries and aquaculture, there's been massive depletion of wild fish stocks over recent years and decades, often to provide the feed for aquaculture itself. Pollution from aquaculture, for example, sea lice from farmed salmon systems, is a huge problem then in wild fisheries. And if we look at cropping sectors, whether it's for feed, for animals, or for human consumption, the cereal monocultures and crop monocultures around the world are generating huge environmental problems, particularly their reliance on huge quantities of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. And despite the claims that we can do this more efficiently and precision agriculture can make the difference, we're still seeing massive increases in the global use of pesticides, and pesticide use is also increasing within Europe. And this is generating huge problems in terms of biodiversity loss, particularly pollinators. It's also affecting the soil. Europe lost 970 million tons of soil, loses that every year. And there's moderate to high soil erosion on more than 10% of EU territory. I'm focusing here on the environmental problems, but this is a broader crisis across food systems. And if we look at the socio-economic impacts for a moment, it's clear that the current production models are having a major toll on farmers' livelihoods. In the EU alone, the share of value going to farmers from the food chain has been declining substantially over recent years. It was 30% in 1995. It's recently been estimated at more like 21%. So these are major reductions. There's clearly downward pressures on farmers, on their margins. Very difficult to make a living, particularly for small-scale farms. And 1 in 4 farms actually disappeared from the European landscape between 2003 and 2013. It's also the most dangerous sector in the world. High rates of injury, depression, suicide. So this is a very bleak picture, but I wanted to put everything on the table first. The point here is that livestock is not the only problem. And if we frame the debate only in terms of a protein transition from livestock to plant-based proteins, we might miss the bigger picture. What we at PROTEIN2FOOD see as the source of this problem is the industrial logic at the heart of our food chains. What do we mean by that? We mean highly specialized, highly uniform production systems that rely on chemical inputs as a way of managing agroecosystems. We mean systems where we've disconnected crops from livestock, and in doing so, we've produced these segregated systems that are highly reliant on importing nutrients, importing energy into the system, and exporting waste flows out of them. So we've broken the kind of circularity of those systems. And industrial food systems refer to systems based on low costs, driving down the costs, driving down the margins, and high externalities. So impacts that affect other people, future generations, other parts of the world, not taken into account in the production model, not necessarily seen by the consumer when they're getting a good bargain in the supermarket. So, in light of this context, what we need is not just a protein transition, we need a broader transition in our food systems from industrial agriculture to a different model based on agroecology. And agroecology is a term that you're probably hearing used more and more. It's been adopted by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization recently, who's seeing the value of this type of model and is really gaining visibility and awareness in many parts of the world. When we talk about agroecology, or more specifically at PROTEIN2FOOD, we talk about diversified agroecological farming as the model that we want to go towards. We're referring to a range of different systems that fit under that umbrella, from agroforestry to mixed crop livestock systems, mixed rice-fish systems in some parts of the world, highly diverse polycultures, multi-species farming. And the key point on the right here is that all of these systems, while diverse, are underpinned by the same set of principles, which are really fundamentally different to the principles of industrial agriculture. They're systems that maximize diversity at every level, diversity of crops, species, wild biodiversity, and they use that biodiversity instead of using chemicals to fight pests and to fertilize the soil. They're systems that build climate resilience, not through specific improved seeds, but by improving the quality of the soil, by improving the health of the soil so that it can trap CO2 and become a carbon sink, and so that the soil can store more water, which is important when droughts hit. And these are systems that have diverse outputs, so farmers' livelihoods are not reliant on a single product and tend to rely on short supply chains, direct sales, and less middlemen, which is important, again, given the problems we've seen with the margins, low margins farmers have, and the pressures from their buyers. This diagram shows in a very rough way that when we talk about agroecology, it's not just a solution for subsistence agriculture in developing countries to move in that direction, as is sometimes portrayed to be. It's really the direction of travel that we need, whether your starting point is subsistence agriculture or industrial agriculture. Very briefly, I mean, there's a growing evidence base on the benefits of agroecology. The key point to mention here is that agroecology delivers co-benefits, and it's in some of the cases where it's been well documented, you can see that it has improvements for productivity and environmental and social benefits at the same time. The environmental benefits are perhaps the most obvious, huge benefits, up to 40% additional soil organic carbon in agroforestry systems, according to a recent meta-study. Plenty of data on improvements in wild biodiversity around the farms, practicing agroecology, up to 50% in some organic systems. And diversified agriculture is very clearly correlated to diversified diets at the farm and community level. Certainly those links could be developed more, and that's something we might talk about later. And as a result, as we know, diversified diets really is the key to health and healthy diet. And as I mentioned, these benefits have been achieved without there being necessarily a trade-off with productivity. And in fact, by virtue of having a healthy agroecosystem with pollinators returning to the fields, this often has a positive impact on yields. There's more data that's still being gathered in this area, but some of the largest studies have shown that yields are broadly comparable between organic or agroecological systems and conventional, on the other hand. Only an 8% difference in developed countries, while in developing countries, organic yields were actually 80% higher in this study. And there's some recent data generated on agroecology conversion in Europe, showing that in a range of sectors and countries around Europe, there are strong income benefits for those shifting to agroecology, although the range is still vast. So this leads to an obvious question. If the benefits of agroecology are so clear, if it's so obvious that we need to recombine crops and livestock and farm in this diversified way, why is change not happening faster? Why are we not seeing greater numbers of farmers shifting in this direction? The first thing to note is that there has been a remarkable shift towards agroecology in spite of very little policy support for this model. One recent study suggested that around 30% of farms globally have crossed a threshold where they've really fundamentally redesigned their farming practices and are adopting agroecology in its various forms. But there are major barriers to this transition, and those are barriers that we need to be aware of as we talk about the protein transition as well. As I mentioned at IPES Food, we are very interested in the complexity of food systems, the connections and dependencies between different parts of the chain and different aspects of food systems, from what happens on the farm level to the research and innovation pathways to the policy imperatives and the consumer debates. And we've identified a series of 8 lock-ins referring to the factors keeping industrial food systems in place, reproducing that logic and that model, even when its impacts are very negative and there's clearly a need to change. I'm not going to go into detail on all 8 because we'd be here all day, but just to give an example, concentration of power is in the middle of this diagram. and that's not a coincidence. This is an absolutely crucial factor. The current food systems that I've described are generating huge economic value for the companies who are able to provide the solutions that can work universally, that can sell around the world. Huge market share has been captured by a limited number of companies in the seed and chemical sectors, also distribution, processing through to retail. And this economic power translates into political power. It's the ability to set the terms of the debate on the political level, marketing, lobbying. There are many mechanisms through which these companies can really influence the trajectory of food systems and ensure that we're asking questions that lead back to the solutions they're able to provide and really keep us within the status quo. And it follows that the most promising solutions are not going to be the ones that just tweak the system on the edges. They're going to be the solutions that challenge these lock-ins head on. And come back to that when we talk about the new proteins. So, as I mentioned, things are changing on the production side. There is this shift towards agroecology. And there is also a remarkable shift in consumer trends, particularly around proteins. Data you're probably very familiar with, the rise of vegetarianism and veganism. 13% of people in the UK now identify as vegan or vegetarian, a further 20% as flexitarian. In the US, 6% of people are now vegan, up from 1% just a few years ago. So there's clearly an upward trajectory. I'm sorry I don't have data for the EU here, but I'm sure someone in the room has it. In parallel, and very much linked to this trend, the rise of meat analogues, and we'll be hearing lots about that today, here referring to novel plant-based alternatives like the Impossible Burger, the rise of lab-grown meat, cultured meat, which is also absorbing a lot of investment and interest. And some projections suggest that alternative meats could reach 10% of the total meat market by 2030, which is quite remarkable from being non-existent a couple of years ago. But this raises a number of questions, given what we've discussed about the industrial logic of the food system and the need for a broader paradigm shift. The questions that this raises for me, for IPES Food, are these trends, are these new consumer trends, these new protein trends, helping to make food systems more sustainable? Are they reinforcing industrial food systems or actually helping to weaken its grip and to promote more broadly a transition to sustainable, agroecological, diversified food systems? The simple answer is we don't know yet. As I said, we're in our own research, we're at an early stage here, and so many of these new products are only just coming onto the market or even not yet on the market, and it's very difficult to assess their full implications at this stage. But clearly we're at a crossroads, and the way that these products are adopted, discussed at the political level, the way the protein debate develops will be very important in terms of the implications for sustainability across food systems. What we can say at this point is that there are certainly several risks in the way that the novel proteins and the protein debate is emerging, and these are risks that we would have to confront if we are going to ensure positive outcomes from this emerging transition. The first risk, that we replace industrial animal proteins with industrial plant proteins. This is the most obvious one. If we just change the source of our proteins, but the rest of the supply chain stays the same, and the logic of the supply chain remains the same, then we won't have achieved very much. Some of the novel plant-based meats could appear to be relying on typical sourcing from industrial supply chains, various ingredients, each produced in monocultures with high impacts. That doesn't get us really towards sustainable food systems. One thing that's clear already is that the new high-protein foods do appear to have quite high energy requirements, particularly those based on intensive lab processes. That's an important consideration, given what we've discussed about the need to reconnect the dots in food systems to rebuild circularity and resource efficiency. along the lines of an agroecological model. Systems that have high external energy requirements don't really fit that and would be taking us in a different direction. There's also a risk of overemphasizing protein, when it would be a shame if people following the debates were to take away that the only option is to have a beef burger or an Impossible burger. Therefore, that you have to rely on high-protein foods in specific forms, when in reality, we also need to build awareness of the need for diversified diets to consume food in different forms. And through history, there are plenty of examples where specific nutrients have been emphasized a great deal, whether it's protein or specific vitamins. And emphasizing one of those aspects may lead to misunderstandings about what a healthy diet really is and how protein does need to come along with plenty of different macro and micronutrients which can be sourced from many different foods and don't need to come from a burger in any form. The second risk is that we're putting more power in the hands of the food industry. I mentioned the concentration of power as one of the key lock-ins of industrial food systems. The diagram you're seeing on the right shows, it's probably not very visible from where you're sitting, but the idea is the companies in the middle, some of the most dominant companies in the food processing retail sectors, those parent companies actually own many of the other brands that we recognize and know in our food systems, but that link is not necessarily visible. The point here is that market share is highly concentrated in food systems. There is a limited number of companies with huge power to really set the trajectories in our food systems, as mentioned. And what we're seeing now is that the major meat processing companies, companies like Cargill, are among those investing the most heavily in plant-based proteins. This could be seen as a positive in that they're changing their model and looking to the future, but I think it should also be raising alarm bells, given that these companies have been driving the industrial meat sector with all of its negative impacts. And as mentioned, more market power does mean more power to block reforms that might be needed. For example, when we're looking at agricultural subsidies and where they go, and it gives companies more power, more funds to pour into marketing and to be shaping our habits and ensuring that people keep increasing their consumption of high-protein foods, whether or not that's needed for those particular individuals in the particular regions they're in. The third risk I see in the current debates is that we fall for silver bullet solutions. What you see on the left here is an article recently published in The Guardian by British environmentalist and writer George Monbiot, who is arguing that we can and should produce all of our food in a lab, not only meats, but almost all of what we consume. And here it's important to differentiate between lab-based foods and other novel plant-based alternatives. The lab-based approach, again, we don't have that much data yet about it, but there's clearly a risk of a silver bullet syndrome, and we've seen this before in food systems. This argument, the idea that we should grow all of our food in a lab, relies on a set of major assumptions. First of all, it assumes that if we do that, then the land we're not using for agriculture will become a haven for biodiversity and nature. And history has proven that doesn't happen very easily. And we have plenty of examples of where agricultural productivity has increased, and you would assume then we can use less land to produce the same food. But very rarely does the land actually go out of production. When aquaculture was introduced, the promise was that this will allow the seas to be rewilded and rehabilitated, but actually, looking at the state of marine environments right now, that does not appear to have panned out in reality. And another assumption here is that we need to produce food in a lab because we can't reform farming. We can't reform our conventional agricultural food systems, which seems like a bizarre assumption to make, given that agroecology is showing so much potential and given we've provided so little public support to this model so far. It would seem much more obvious and a much lower cost solution to really try to invest in sustainable, diversified production systems that we know can deliver co-benefits and we know need that funding and need that political capital, which is a limited resource. So I'll be wrapping up now. Those are just three of the risks that we see in this debate. And like I said, I just wanted to give you a flavor of IPES Food's thinking on this topic. We will be publishing on meat and proteins later in the year. To wrap up and conclude on what I've said, I think we need to focus on what we know works and the things that we know can help to overcome the lock-ins of industrial agriculture and industrial food systems, and that means principally focusing on diversified agriculture and diversified diets. We also need to ensure that a diversity of plant-based proteins are available, accessible, and attractive to people. As stated at the start, livestock systems are fundamentally unsustainable. And so the work of projects like Protein2Food is very important in making that a reality, helping to build our understanding of what makes different protein-based foods attractive to people. It's just crucial that that debate happens really in the context of this broader debate about sustainable food systems and is grounded in and reinforces the understanding that we do need a fundamental change in paradigm, not just a change in our protein sources. And one thing that we're hoping to deliver in our report, and one thing that is really crucially needed, is that we are able to agree on a way of assessing and comparing different high-protein foods holistically. There's plenty of data produced by the companies, the manufacturers, but they tend to look at isolated impacts, certainly not the whole life cycle, including all of the externalities. And in particular, and this is something IPES Food can bring to the debate, is the political economy, thinking about the implications of the different choices regarding proteins, what innovation pathways come alongside them, what does it mean in terms of power, equity, opportunity costs. And crucially, these debates must take into account regional specificities in terms of availabilities of protein, the impacts of different production systems. I look forward to your questions and to learning much more about Protein2Food over the course of the day. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Thank you. So, very rich discussion there, a very clear warning that we need to see this broader context, as you said. But within that, I'd be interested to get your views, your advice for the protein sector on what they are doing and what they could do in the future. But any questions to Nick or comments? And please do introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Olga Kiku from Compassion World Farming. Thank you very much, Nick. You mentioned that your latest slides were very interesting because you mentioned that replacing industrial animal proteins with industrial plant proteins will still keep the industrial system going and won't make much of a difference. However, we're not looking at one important factor here, and this is the involvement of animals in the equation and the ethical component about this, because we are using and killing over 80 billion land animals worldwide every year, and from 1 to 3 sea animals, trillion sea animals. Therefore, we need to also look into this, not just the fact that we are talking about industrial agriculture, but with the advent of technology and plant-based sources of food, maybe we can make a difference, at least for the animals and, of course, for the planet.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. Other comments or questions to what you have heard? Or is it too early in the day for you? Nick, could I ask you, in relation to, as you said, this protein transition has to be part of this much, much broader transition. But when it comes to proteins specifically, obviously you want to focus as much, as you said, on the how we produce as the what we're producing. So when giving this sector advice on how to build on the work they've done, how to really make the protein part of this transition happen, do you have recommendations, suggestions for them?
Yeah, I'll try to respond to both questions. I'm not sure I have recommendations for the sector per se, but I think we can certainly say that the total consumption and production of animal products is not sustainable. That's clear. So it is absolutely crucial to keep developing alternatives. And certainly people's eating habits have been influenced by meat eating, whether they consume large quantities or small quantities of meat. The burger as a concept is important in our understanding of what we want to eat. So having alternatives that look and taste like a burger do have a place in food systems and probably will help to shift consumption habits to more sustainable options. But as mentioned, I think it's just crucial that we focus not only on the whole chain, and that's something that's very valuable, I think, in the protein-to-food approach from the presentation I saw. But we really disaggregate different production systems. So even if the final goal is to produce a sustainable plant-based alternative, we should be looking in detail at the agricultural system underpinning that. Is it sustainable because it's plant-based? Not necessarily. It needs to be sustainable because it's plant-based and because there's been attention to the way it's produced, to ensuring a maximum of diversity in the production system, a minimum of synthetic inputs, and as many co-benefits as possible in terms of the livelihoods farmers have. We need, all of us working on these topics, need to be insisting on this triple bottom line of sustainability and making sure that any solutions we're putting forward are ticking all of those boxes and are not just addressing one problem, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, farmer incomes, in a way that exacerbates other problems. So I don't know if that's something for protein-to-food or maybe for the political level when we're drawing the conclusions from these projects and saying where does the support need to go in food systems, what kind of conditions and requirements need to be made on research projects to ensure the maximum sustainability benefits. But I would reiterate that key point in my presentation. The production model really matters. And I think it's absolutely compatible with this kind of research to be focused also on diversity in production
Indeed, and that
systems.
question of production and process has been one of the key focuses of the project. Andreas, please introduce yourself to the room.
Well, I'm Andreas from the Protein2Food Consortium. And Nick, I find it interesting that you mentioned the issue of concentration of power. And in the Protein2Food Consortium, we have a number of SMEs, and we see that SMEs are very often the first movers, those who develop the ideas and the new products. And then maybe after a certain time, these new ideas are incorporated by those concentrators of power. Do you see, when you discuss among your scientists the different risks and problems, particularly this one seems to me quite difficult to address and to find solutions. Do you see ways of how to break that concentration of power?
Thank you very much. Let's take it straight away. Go on, David.
Great question. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. It's the central lock-in of our 8 lock-ins. We also produced a report looking specifically at the mergers and acquisitions that have taken place over recent years, from Bayer Monsanto to mergers Amazon Whole Foods on the retail side, and thinking about the implications, particularly for innovation, as you said. And one of the key impacts we found is that the more concentrated these companies become, the less kind of fundamental research they do, and the more they rely on buying up small and medium-sized startups who are doing the innovation, and that really has an impact of changing those innovation pathways. How do we break it? Very difficult question. I think there are a number of solutions. Some of them are really at the EU level and the global political level in terms of applying antitrust rules more assertively. But we don't need to rely on that. I think if one of the benefits of an agroecological model is that you break this reliance on these major buyers and major providers of inputs, and you don't rely on them anymore to set the conditions you're producing under. So part of this transition, it's not just about changing the production model and production practices. For a lot of people promoting agroecology, the socioeconomic components are just as important. Developing short supply chains, and trust-based relationships with consumers is a crucial part of that. But I'm not going to pretend that's easy, and obviously a farmer in close proximity to a big city has more opportunities to sell directly, like the farmers who sell here in the Marché des Tanneurs, who can get a good price for their organic produce. Very difficult for a farmer in a remote, poor region to do that.
And we'll discuss, I hope, later on issues like the role of producer organisations in all of this and other such issues. But any other questions for... I see two more. I'll take them both and then we'll have to wrap this session up. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. My name is Ulrike. I come from a company that has been manufacturing vegan health food since 1925. So we are quite interested, being a small company with like 60 persons in what was just discussed. But one of your first statistics was that since 1961, the consumption of meat has doubled. So have you ever thought about just falling back to what we did then in agriculture, because then agriculture was more on the short, directly way, and it would be much easier for people to understand, well, we can do it, we have done it before, it's easy to manage to just do what we did in agriculture.
Sorry, what do you mean by falling back?
To the 60s. What did we do in farming in the 60s? The food was half the amount of meat we consumed then. So, and it would be so easy to grasp for people to say we can do it.
So as a way of communicating what we need to do?
Yeah, or isn't
it
possible, because it's so much more human beings on Earth now, so that's why we have to have a different system.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'll take the other one as well, and then we'll deal with them together if we might. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Milka Sokolovic from UFIC.
Can you hold the mic a little,
Yes.
please? That's it.
Milka Sokolovic from UFIC, also one of the consortium partners. Well, thanks for the very nice helicopter view of the current situation. I was thinking we are contrasting the industrial food systems with the agroecological approach. And what we would like to see is a transition towards circular economy and sustainable food systems. But I would say the fact is that the society we live in has a very linear political system that is based and built on the industrial food systems. So how do you see the transition of the political systems towards circular political systems? So towards those systems that would, from the political side, support the circular economy and sustainable food systems.
Thank you very much indeed. Nick.
Okay, I'll take the second question first, just because it's fresh in my head. We have also spent a lot of time thinking about what political frameworks we need to address the sustainability problems we face. I think you're absolutely right to say that we do have a linear approach. You could also describe it as a silo approach. We decide on agriculture within agricultural ministries, even though it has implications far beyond farmers and food companies. And one of the things that we're proposing at IPES Food is to move towards integrated food policies. In 2019, we published a report calling for a common food policy in the EU, and we're very happy to see developments towards a farm-to-fork strategy now. I think this really has to be the basis of the solution, because if we have an integrated food policy, we can set kind of overarching objectives for our food system, like circularity, like healthy diets, like transition to agroecology. We have that long-term vision and the direction of travel, and then we can make sure that the sectoral policies, from agriculture to trade to food safety to environment, are kind of aligned with those broad objectives, which we don't have right now. We don't have a set of objectives for our food system. We have a set of priorities within the Common Agricultural Policy that have evolved over time to meet the interests of various people and groups. Yeah. And then moving back to the previous question.
It's really in relation to how we communicate this, how we get that engagement. Is that a way of framing it?
I don't know. I think it's important to bear in mind that when people are shifting towards agroecology, the evidence suggests they're doing it not only because of traditional values and wanting to rekindle how food systems were in the past, but also they are attracted by the knowledge-intensive side of it, by the fact that it does involve technology and social innovation as well. So it's really a question of how we frame it. I think in some ways we do need to go back. I think fundamentally we have developed a model which can't sustain itself. But telling people that we need to go back is maybe not the best way of going back, because it makes it harder to sell, perhaps. And it's certainly, we do need some of the techniques and principles in agroecology go back a long way, like crop rotations and intercropping. Others are based on more recent innovations, kind of push-pull systems, which are very sophisticated. So it's a mix of both, and I think it needs to be sold in that way to bring the maximum amount of people on board with that.
And on that note, mixing the old and the new, will you join me in thanking Nick very much indeed? Thanks so much to you.